The train's steam curled upward into the cold Prussian morning, August 17th, 1940-3. A railway platform. Two men. One conversation that would seal the fate of thousands. General Adolf Galland stood there, watching his commander prepare to leave. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, architect of the Luftwaffe. Hitler's second-in-command was boarding his luxurious private train after another conference about fighter operations. Galland needed just 60 seconds, maybe less. He had intelligence that couldn't wait. Something was happening in German airspace that shouldn't have been possible. Earlier that morning, the Americans had come. Not just bombers, but just the usual formations grinding their way toward Regensburg and SCHWEINFURT. Something else had appeared in the sky. The German pilots had scrambled, as always. They'd watched the American escort fighters, those Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, turn back at the border. Just like they always did. Fuel tanks running dry. The predictable moment when the bombers continued alone into the Reich. That's when German fighters struck. Standard procedure. Textbook interception, and then the sky filled with aircraft that shouldn't have existed. More American fighters, not Thunderbolts. Different silhouettes. Twin-boomed shapes cutting through the air 150 miles inside Germany. Lockheed P-38 Lightnings flying, where no escort fighter should have been able to reach. Galland had spent the hour since, collecting reports from squadron commanders across the Reich. Every report said the same thing. Lightnings equipped with external drop tanks, extra fuel hanging under their wings like bombs. Range extended far beyond anything the Germans had planned for. The entire defensive strategy was built on a simple assumption. Escorts would turn back. Bombers would continue alone. German fighters would attack unmolested by enemy fighters. That assumption had just been shattered over the heartland of the Reich. Galland approached Göring on the platform. He presented the intelligence directly. No preamble. American fighters with extended range were penetrating deep into Germany. Squadron commanders across multiple units reported P-38 Lightnings engaging them over Schweinfurt, over Regensburg, over targets that should have been far beyond escort range. The tactical doctrine, waiting for escorts to exhaust their fuel and turn back, was obsolete. Göring's face flushed red. His voice rose against the hiss of steam, the clatter of the train. He declared it impossible. American fighters had not reached that far into Germany. Reports were wrong. The aircraft Galland described must have been damaged planes that glided eastward from great altitude after being hit over France or Belgium. Flukes, anomalies, not evidence of extended range capability. Galland protested. He explained the drop tank system. Multiple squadrons, same encounters, same day. These weren't damaged aircraft limping home. These were fighters in full combat capability, engaging German aircraft deep inside the Reich. Göring cut him off. The Reichsmarschall stated flatly that it was physically impossible for American fighters to reach that far inland. Then he gave Galland a direct order. He officially declared that American fighters had not crossed into central Germany. This was not a discussion. This was an order. Galland understood immediately. Göring wasn't arguing tactics or intelligence. He was denying reality itself, refusing to accept evidence that contradicted his assumptions about American capabilities. Galland replied with what witnesses would later describe as an unforgettable smile. "Orders are orders, sir." The train pulled away from the platform. Galland watched it disappear into the distance, steam trailing behind like a ghost. He knew in that moment that the Luftwaffe had just lost its opportunity to prepare for a threat that would eventually destroy it. What happened next would doom thousands of German pilots who would die fighting an enemy they'd been told didn't exist. The losses began before the sun set that same day, August 17th, 1943. The date of both Galland's warning and the first wave of what was coming. The twin raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg cost the Luftwaffe between 25 and 27 fighters. Many fell to those impossible long-range P-38 escorts. The mission demonstrated exactly what Galland had tried to warn about. American bombers penetrating deep into Germany, continuous fighter escort, far beyond previously observed ranges. German fighters attacking the bombers only to be engaged by P-38 escorts appearing from altitude at unexpected distances from England. The exchange was brutal. 60 American bombers destroyed, but German fighter losses and pilot casualties were severe. For the first time, Luftwaffe faced American bomber formations escorted throughout their entire penetration into German airspace, not just to the border, not halfway, all the way to the target. The tactical assumption that escorts would turn back at predictable points had been obliterated. German fighter commanders now had to assume American escorts could appear anywhere, anytime, far deeper into Germany than their doctrine suggested was possible. 3 weeks later, September 6, 1940-3, another disaster proved Galland's warnings correct. American B-17 bombers struck Stuttgart with P-38 escorts reaching deep into southern Germany. Major Egon Meyer led the interception, one of Germany's most successful bomber destroyers. 57 kills to his name. He'd pioneered the head-on attack against American heavy bombers, recognizing that frontal attacks minimized exposure to the bombers. Defensive fire. His squadron attacked from ahead of the formation as planned. They scored hits on several bombers, then P-38 escorts dove from altitude. The escorts had been positioned above and behind the bomber stream, waiting, watching, patient mares. Formation scattered. 3. Meyer himself barely escaped when a P-38 locked onto his tail. He pushed his Messerschmitt Bf-109 into a steep dive and outran the heavier American fighter, but 5 of his squadron didn't return. 3 pilots killed, 2 captured after bailing out. 0 bombers confirmed destroyed. Complete failure by October 1943. The pattern was unmistakable. American bombers striking deep into Germany with fighter escorts that Göring had declared impossible. The Luftwaffe continued fighting using tactics based on assumptions that were demonstrably false. Pilots were told escorts couldn't reach certain targets. They planned their attacks accordingly. Then the escorts appeared and shot them down. October 14th. Black Thursday. Another Schweinfurt raid. Catastrophic losses for both sides. The Americans lost 60 bombers. The Luftwaffe lost 38 fighters with pilots killed or wounded 2 months later. December 4th, 1940-3, Hauptmann Wilhelm Lem of Jagdflieger 3 was killed near Dodewaard in the Netherlands. Shot down during combat with P-47 Thunderbolts of the 352nd Fighter. Group 131 kills. 1 of Germany's most successful aces. 23 years old, the loss of experienced aces like Lem represented an irreplaceable depletion of the Luftwaffe's combat effectiveness. Black Thursday demonstrated both the strength and weakness of the American bombing strategy. 60 bombers lost in a single day, 9% of the attacking force. 600 aircrew killed or captured, unsustainable without fighter escort to the target and back. The American 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids for several weeks after Black Thursday to rebuild strength and await the arrival of more long-range escorts. But for the Luftwaffe, the raid represented something equally ominous. Despite achieving their highest bomber kill count of the war, German fighter losses were approaching parity with bomber kills. 60 bombers destroyed, 38 fighters and 42 pilots lost. Before the advent of long-range escorts, the exchange rate had been 3 or 4 bombers destroyed for every fighter lost. Now it was approaching 1-2-1. At that rate, the Luftwaffe would be ground down through attrition long before American bomber strength was seriously degraded. Galland understood the mathematics. He compiled another detailed report in November 1943. The report analyzed monthly fighter losses from June through October. June, 87. Fighters lost July, 106, August, 170-4, September, 190-3, October, 220-4. The trend was undeniable. Losses were accelerating. Worse, the ratio of experienced pilots to novices was inverted. In June, 60% of fighter pilots had more than 6 months of combat experience by October. Only 40% did. The Luftwaffe was losing its most valuable asset. Experienced pilots who could survive combat and train the next generation. Galland warned that, without immediate intervention, the fighter force would reach a critical breaking point within 6 months. After that point, losses would exceed the training pipeline's capacity to produce replacements. The fighter force would enter a death spiral from which recovery would be impossible. He sent the report to Göring, to the Air Ministry. To anyone in the chain of command who would listen, the response was silence. Göring refused to acknowledge the crisis. The Air Ministry issued directives calling for improved morale and more aggressive tactics. Nobody addressed the fundamental problem. German pilots were outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outmatched by better-trained Allied opponents flying superior long-range fighters. Galland documented every loss, compiled reports, sent weekly summaries to Göring and the High Command. He described the tactical situation in detail. American fighters with extended range were escorting bombers throughout German airspace. Old doctrine of waiting for escorts to turn back was obsolete. New tactics were needed. Immediately, fighter production needed to increase. Pilot training needed to expand. The Me-262 jet fighter should be rushed into service despite development problems. Its speed advantage would allow it to penetrate escort screens and attack bombers. Galland received no response from Göring. The Reichsmarschall had made his decision in August. American long-range fighters were not a strategic threat. The Luftwaffe would continue current operations. Nothing would change, but everything was about to change. The situation deteriorated through November and December 1943 as American fighter capabilities expanded beyond even what Galland had warned about. Then on December 1st, 1943, something new appeared over Germany that made the P-38 threat seem manageable by comparison. The North American P-51 Mustang entered combat. The P-51 had been flying for 2 years in various roles. The Royal Air Force used early versions for low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack. The United States Army Air Forces used them in North Africa and the Mediterranean. But these early Mustangs had Allison engines that performed poorly at high altitude. They couldn't escort bombers in the stratosphere where the air wore over. Germany was fought. German intelligence knew about these early Mustangs. Luftwaffe analysts had concluded they posed no threat to high-altitude bomber operations. Then North American Aviation installed the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the Mustang airframe. The Merlin had a 2-stage supercharger that maintained power above 30,000 feet. The combination of the Mustang's efficient aerodynamics and the Merlin's high-altitude performance created something extraordinary. An American fighter that could fly as high as any German fighter, faster than most German fighters at altitude, turn with German fighters in a dogfight, and with twice the range of any previous escort. When fitted with 2 external drop tanks, the P-51 could fly over 800 miles from its base, spend time in combat over the target, and return home. Berlin was 600 miles from England. Every industrial target in Germany was now within reach of escorted daylight bombing. December 1st, 1943. The 354th Fighter Group flew the first P-51B combat mission over Europe from Boxted Airfield in England. The unit had received its aircraft only days earlier. Many pilots had less than 5 hours in the P-51 before their first combat mission, but the aircraft was intuitive to fly. Forgiving of pilot error, it responded crisply to controls, accelerated rapidly, could sustain high-speed maneuvering without losing energy. American pilots who had flown P-47s described the Mustang as flying like a fighter half its weight. December 5th. The P-51s escorted bombers to Amiens in northern France. December 11th. They reached Emden on the German coast. December 13th, 1943. Breakthrough. 50-5 P-51 Mustangs escorted B-17 bombers to Kiel, 480 miles from England, 140 miles inside Germany. The mission lasted for hours and 30 minutes. The Mustangs engaged Luftwaffe interceptors over the target and shot down 6 German fighters without loss. American bombers struck U-boat construction facilities with minimal interference. The mission proved that American heavy bombers could now reach any target in Germany with fighter protection. The escort problem that had plagued the strategic bombing campaign since 1942 was solved. Galland recognized the threat immediately. He flew to Berlin to meet with Göring in late December 1940-3. He presented intelligence on the P-51, technical specifications, performance data, combat reports from pilots who had engaged the new fighter. The P-51 was faster than the Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190. At all altitudes, it could turn with German fighters. It had longer range than any previous escort. With external drop tanks, it could reach any target in Germany. Galland recommended emergency measures. All available resources should focus on fighter production. The Me-262 jet program should receive top priority. Training should be accelerated despite fuel shortages. Germany needed to adapt immediately or face strategic defeat in the air war. Göring dismissed the concerns. He stated the P-51 was just another American fighter. German pilots were superior. German tactics were superior. The Luftwaffe would prevail through skill and courage, Galland argued, showed Göring the intelligence reports. Explained what would happen if P-51s escorted bombers too. Berlin. Göring refused to listen. The meeting ended. Galland returned to his headquarters knowing the Luftwaffe had sealed its own fate. The American strategic bombing intensified through January and February 1944. P-51 Mustangs appeared in growing numbers. They escorted bombers to Frankfurt, to Leipzig, 2 targets throughout central Germany. Luftwaffe losses climbed steadily. Then February 20th, 1940-4. The Americans launched Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. 6 days of concentrated attacks on German aircraft factories. The goal? Destroy the Luftwaffe's production capacity and force German fighters into battle where they could be annihilated. Over 3,500 American bombers struck targets across Germany, all escorted by swarms of P-38, P-47, and P-51 fighters. The Luftwaffe committed everything to stopping the raids. Every available fighter squadron threw itself into the battle. Experienced aces flew multiple sorties per day. New pilots with minimal training were rushed into combat. The casualties were catastrophic. During Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters destroyed and another 180 damaged beyond immediate repair. Pilot losses were even worse. Approximately 100 pilots killed, 90 wounded, 43 missing. Among the dead were squadron commanders, flight leaders, and experienced combat veterans who could not be replaced. Major Egon Meyer, who had survived the September 6 disaster, was killed on March 2nd. Shot down by P-47 escorts over France. 102 kills. 29 years old, Hauptmann Kurt Oben of Jagdflieger 3 was killed on February 2nd during a bomber interception over Brunswick. 110 kills, 20-4 years old. These weren't novice pilots. These were the core of Germany's fighter expertise. The men who trained new pilots, the leaders who organized effective tactics, aces who could engage multiple enemies and survive. They were dying at rates that made replacement impossible. Galland watched the casualty lists with growing despair. A fighter pilot needed 6 months of training to be minimally competent, a year to be good, 2 years to be excellent. Germany was losing pilots with 2, 3, 4 years of combat experience, replacing them with pilots who had 3 months of training. Some new pilots arrived at frontline squadrons with less than 200 total flight hours they faced. American pilots with 400 to 500 hours of training. The skill gap was enormous. The outcome was predictable. New German pilots survived an average of 5 combat missions. 5 missions. Then they were killed or wounded. The Luftwaffe was being destroyed not just through losses of aircraft, but through the systematic annihilation of its pilot corps. The training crisis had complex causes. Germany had never planned for a long war of attrition. The Luftwaffe training system in 1939 had been designed to produce a steady stream of replacement pilots for a force that would achieve quick victories through tactical superiority. It assumed that experienced pilots would survive to lead new pilots and pass on combat knowledge. It assumed that fuel for training would always be available. It assumed that training airfields would be safe from enemy attack. By 1944, all these assumptions had proven false. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could train replacements. Fuel allocations to training schools had been cut repeatedly too. Prioritize frontline operations. Allied fighters and bombers attacked training airfields, destroying aircraft and killing instructors. The training pipeline that had produced excellent pilots in 1940 had collapsed into a system that sent barely competent pilots to their deaths. Galland tried desperately to fix the training system. He requested increased fuel allocations for flight schools, recommended pulling experienced pilots from combat for instructor duty, proposed shortening the operational tours of highly skilled pilots so they could survive to train the next generation. Every request was denied. Göring insisted that all available resources go to frontline operations. Germany needed fighters in combat, not in schools. The Reich couldn't afford to pull experienced pilots from battle to teach when those pilots were needed to defend against daily American raids. This logic was superficially correct, but strategically suicidal. By refusing to invest in training, Germany ensured that its pilot quality would decline continuously until the force could no longer function effectively, regardless of how many aircraft were produced. The Americans understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. In early 1944, General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in January. He changed the fighter escort doctrine. Previously, American fighters had been ordered to stay close to the bomber formations and provide direct protection. Doolittle gave his fighters freedom to pursue German aircraft aggressively. Fighter groups were sent ahead of bomber formations to hunt for Luftwaffe fighters while they were forming up. Mustang groups were tasked with strafing German airfields to destroy aircraft on the ground. The goal wasn't just to protect bombers. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe completely by killing pilots and destroying aircraft wherever they could be found. The new doctrine was devastatingly effective. German pilots faced American fighters, not just over the target, but throughout their entire mission. Taking off from their airfields, they could be attacked during climb-out. Forming up could be bounced by roaming Mustang patrols. Approaching the bombers, they had to fight through escort screens. After the engagement, returning to base with damaged aircraft and low fuel, they could be pursued and shot down. There was no safe phase of operations. American fighters were everywhere. They had the numbers, performance, and pilot quality to dominate every engagement. March 4th, 1940-4. The strategic situation reached a point of no return. American bombers struck Berlin for the first time with full fighter escort. Over 600 heavy bombers attacked the German capital. Escorting them were 174 P-51 Mustangs that flew the entire 1,100-mile round trip. The Mustangs fought German defenders over the heart of the Third Reich. They shot down 16 Luftwaffe fighters. They lost only 4 aircraft. Berlin, the city that Hermann Göring had promised would never be bombed. Now within range of American daylight bombing with complete fighter protection, Göring reportedly said privately that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. But he said it privately, publicly, continued insisting everything was under control. The Luftwaffe was still strong. German pilots were still the best in the world. The Americans would eventually run out of aircraft and pilots. Germany would win. The reality was very different. By April 1944, Galland faced a crisis so severe that he filed a report directly with the High Command, bypassing Göring entirely. The report was dated April 27, 1940-4. It outlined the catastrophic state of the Luftwaffe fighter force in the previous 10 major operations. The Luftwaffe had lost approximately 500 aircraft and 400 pilots. Over the previous 4 months, from January through April, more than 1,000 pilots had been killed, wounded, or captured. The enemy outnumbered German fighters 6-1 in some operations, 8-1 in others. The standard of Allied fighter pilot training was astonishingly high. Most American and British pilots entering combat had 400 to 500 hours of flight time. German pilots were being sent into battle with less than 200 hours. Some had less than 150. The training infrastructure had collapsed due to fuel shortages and constant Allied attacks on airfields. Galland stated in his report that he would at this moment rather have one Me-262 in action than 5 Bf-8-109s. The Me-262 was the jet fighter that Galland had advocated deploying for months. It was faster than any Allied fighter by 100 miles per hour. It could break through escort screens and attack bombers without being intercepted. But Hitler had insisted it be developed as a bomber. It's not a fighter. Precious months had been wasted converting it to carry bombs instead of maximizing its potential as an interceptor. By the time Hitler reversed his decision in late 1944 and allowed jet fighter production, it was too late to stop the hemorrhaging of the Luftwaffe fighter force. The losses continued through spring. In summer 1944, between January and May, 62 German fighter pilots were killed, wounded, or went missing. March alone saw catastrophic attrition. LUFTWAFFE records show that in March 1944, the fighter force suffered extraordinary losses that effectively broke its back. Entire squadrons were decimated. Jagdflieger 11 lost 28 pilots in 3 weeks. Jagdflieger 3 lost 31. These were elite units with years of combat experience. They were being shattered against overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. The numbers told the story of annihilation. Germany could lose 10 fighters and struggle to replace them within a month. The Americans could lose 100 fighters and replace them within days. The British could lose 50 bombers and have them replaced within a week. The industrial capacity was not equal. The pilot training pipeline was not equal. The strategic situation was not equal. Germany was losing a war of attrition it could never win. June 6, 1940-4. The Allies launched Operation Overlord. The invasion of Normandy. The Luftwaffe was supposed to contest the invasion with massive fighter and bomber strikes against the landing beaches. Luftflotte 3 responsible for defending. France had 481 aircraft available on June 5th. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe managed to fly 319 sorties. The Allies flew 14,674. The disparity was so complete that many Allied soldiers didn't see a single German aircraft during the first week of the invasion. German pilots who did attempt to attack the invasion fleet faced walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Allied fighters. Few survived. The Normandy campaign marked the final collapse of Luftwaffe effectiveness in the West. OBERSTLEUTNANT Joseph Pips Preiler, commander of Jagdflieger 26, was one of Germany's most successful fighter leaders. 101 kills, including 68 Spitfires, the highest score against that aircraft type. On D-Day morning, Preiler and his wingman Feldwebel Heinz Waterchick were the only German pilots to attack the invasion beaches directly, flying to Focke-Wulf 190s from Lille at extremely low altitude to avoid detection. They strafed Sword Beach, then escaped back to base. Their 2 aircraft constituted the entire German fighter response to the largest amphibious invasion in history. Preiler later stated the mission was suicidal, but necessary to show that the Luftwaffe hadn't completely abandoned the German army. He survived the war and died in 1961. The weeks after, D-Day saw some of the most desperate and futile air combat of the entire war. Luftwaffe units threw themselves against overwhelming Allied air power in a doomed attempt to support German ground forces. Losses were staggering by the end of June 1944. The Luftwaffe had lost over 300 fighters in the West. July losses exceeded 400, August losses approached 500. Aircraft production actually increased during this period. German factories were producing over 1,500 fighters per month by mid-1940-4, but the aircraft couldn't be effectively used. There was insufficient fuel to train pilots properly. There weren't enough experienced pilots to fly the new aircraft. Spare parts were in short supply. Maintenance facilities were being bombed. Even when aircraft could be made operational, they rarely survived more than a handful of missions before being shot down. By July, Galland was receiving casualty reports showing 50 fighter pilots killed or missing every single day. Every day. 50 pilots. The Luftwaffe pilot training schools graduated. approximately 30 pilots per week. The mathematics of annihilation were simple and stark. There was no way to sustain operations at these loss rates. The fighter force was dying. Squadron commanders reported that new pilots arriving from training were effectively helpless in combat. They lacked basic combat skills, couldn't maintain formation, panicked under fire, made fundamental errors that got themselves and their wingmen killed. One experienced squadron leader compared receiving new pilots in mid-1944 to executing them. Sending these undertrained pilots into combat against seasoned American and British fighter pilots was tantamount to murder, but there was no choice. Germany had no reserve of trained pilots waiting. Everyone who completed training went immediately to the front and died within weeks. Galland tried everything to change the situation. He pushed for increased production of the Me-262 jet, advocated for improved training programs even though fuel shortages made extensive training impossible, developed new tactics for engaging heavily escorted bomber formations. He personally flew unauthorized combat missions to understand what his pilots faced and to test new approaches. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem wasn't tactics or training or equipment. It was numbers the Americans and British had achieved. Air superiority through overwhelming numerical advantage backed by superior training, better logistics, and unlimited industrial capacity. No amount of German tactical innovation could overcome that reality. There were pilots who understood what was happening and tried to adapt. Oberstleutnant Tend. Johann Steinhoff commanded Jagdflieger 77 through much of 1940-4. He was an experienced leader who eventually reached 176 kills. Steinhoff recognized immediately that old tactics wouldn't work against the new American escorts. He developed aggressive approaches. His squadrons wouldn't wait for escorts to turn back. They would attack immediately, engaging the escorts first to drive them away from the bombers. It was aggressive. It was risky. It achieved some success, but the cost was enormous. Steinhoff's tactics worked in the sense that his unit shot down more enemy aircraft than average, but his losses were also higher than average. For every 2 enemy aircraft destroyed, Jagdflieger 77 lost nearly to fighters. At that rate, no unit could sustain operations for more than a few months. The best German pilots were dying. The most innovative commanders were being killed. The tactical knowledge, built over years of combat, was being lost, and there was no one left with enough experience to replace them. Galland himself experienced the futility firsthand on an unauthorized mission in the spring of 1940-4. He flew a Focke-Wulf 190 over Magdeburg, wanting to see what his pilots faced from the cockpit rather than from reports. He found a massive bomber formation escorted by at least 50 fighters. The escort consisted primarily of P-51 Mustangs flying in loose formations above and beside the bombers. Galland picked out a bomber on the edge of the formation and rolled into an attack, just as he began to position for the shot. Tracers streamed past his canopy. 4 Mustangs had dove on him from above. He broke hard and dove. The Mustangs followed. Galland used a trick from earlier in the war. He fired his machine guns forward, creating streams of smoke that drifted back toward the pursuing fighters, giving the illusion of rear-firing guns. The Mustangs broke off into a climbing turn. Galland used the opportunity to dive away and escape at high speed. He returned to base without firing a shot at the bombers. He'd been in position to attack for less than 5 seconds before being engaged by escorts. He understood immediately why his pilots were failing. The American escorts were everywhere, aggressive, skilled, and outnumbered. German fighters by margins that made success impossible. By autumn 1944, Luftwaffe fighter force existed primarily on paper. There were squadrons listed in organizational charts. There were pilots. There were aircraft being produced, but there was no cohesive fighter arm capable of defending German airspace. Fuel shortages grounded entire units for days at a time. New pilots crashed during training because they had insufficient flight hours. Aircraft sat on airfields without spare parts for repairs. When squadrons did manage to launch missions, they faced overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters and bombers. November 2nd, 1940-4 Galland sent 500 fighters against 975 American bombers attacking oil plants, escorted by 800 fighters, 600 of them P-51 Mustangs. The Americans shot down 98 German fighters, 78 pilots killed. The Americans lost only 50 aircraft total, 30 of them to anti-aircraft guns. Germany could no longer afford such losses. Hitler and Göring were furious. With the Ardennes offensive being planned for December, Hitler ordered Galland to prepare his fighter reserves to support the ground attack rather than defend the Reich. Elite fighter wings that had fought for years would now move to support a ground offensive that had no chance of success. Galland knew his planned grosser Schlag, the big blow against American bomber formations, was finished. January 1945. Galland was relieved of his command as General der Jagdflieger on January 13th. Göring blamed Galland for the Luftwaffe's failures, the constant complaints, the defeatist reports, the criticism of leadership. Göring told his staff that Galland had undermined morale and failed to inspire its pilots to achieve victory through willpower and determination. The relief came after what became known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt, when several senior fighter commanders met with Göring to express their grievances about the conduct of the air war. Galland was accused of orchestrating the meeting to undermine Göring's authority. He was placed under house arrest at his hunting lodge. He faced possible court-martial, even execution. The SS and Gestapo opened files on him. Heinrich Himmler sought to put him on trial for treason, but Hitler intervened. The Führer knew Galland's reputation as a skilled combat pilot and respected leader. Hitler also recognized that court-martialing Germany's most famous fighter ace would be a propaganda disaster. Hitler allowed Galland to return to active duty on one condition. Galland would form and command Jagdverband for 4, an elite jet fighter unit equipped with Me-262 aircraft. The unit would be manned by the best surviving fighter pilots in Germany. Galland accepted. Immediately, he gathered 10 holders of the Knight's Cross, experienced aces who had survived years of combat. Among them, Johann Steinhoff with 176 kills, Gerhard Barkhorn with 301 kills, Heinz Bohr with 220 kills. These were some of the most successful fighter pilots in history. They received Me-262 jets beginning in late February and March 1940-5. The Me-262 was everything Galland had claimed it would be. The aircraft was magnificent. Top speed 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. For 30mm cannons, with devastating firepower, could reach 30,000 feet in 7 minutes. The jet engines gave it acceleration that piston engine fighters couldn't match. In combat, the Me-262 could choose when to engage and when to disengage. Allied fighters couldn't catch it in level flight, couldn't catch it in a dive. The only way to shoot down an Me-262 was to catch it during takeoff or landing, when it was slow and vulnerable, or to damage it so severely during a head-on pass that the pilot couldn't control it. Allied fighter pilots quickly learned to patrol near Nome, Me-262 bases, and attack the jets while they were low and slow. This led to fierce battles around German jet airfields, where Allied fighters tried to catch jets during their most vulnerable moments, while conventional German fighters tried to protect them. Galland flew his first combat mission in the Me-262 on March 31st, 1945. Flying from Munchenrium airfield, he intercepted a formation of American bombers near Neuburg. He shot down a B-26 Marauder with a short burst from his 30mm cannons. The bomber came apart under the concentrated firepower. Over the next 4 weeks, Galland added 6 more kills all,